Senior national columnist for Saturday Down South and also Saturday Tradition, host of the SDS Pod as well. And Connor O'Gara joins us, Sikkim 365 Radio and 365 Sports. And Connor, when I reached out to you last week to have you on today, I didn't know maybe one of the stories today would be Pete Thamel. And this has been mentioned before that the SEC might just have their own playoff or their own national championship. How could that actually come about? Do you think it would be successful?
Well, there's two ways to answer that. Would it be successful? Yes. The SEC and its fan base would absolutely be able to sell that from a TV standpoint. There's no doubt that they'd be able to rake in money. Something new in college football usually has that sort of impact. But would it be good overall for the sport? In my opinion, no. And I say that even though I know where exactly my bread is buttered, and I understand that the SEC moves the needle in a way that no other conference has been able to do in the last 15 years. But would it be good overall for the sport? I just don't think that it would. I think that dividing this Power Five at a time like now would just be such a swerve from the 12-team playoff that was proposed last year. But I think Greg Sankey has this in his back pocket, thinking this is a way to combat what the Alliance has been fighting for, which is these really silly kind of contingencies for an expanded playoff. And if Greg Sankey's like, hey, look, we don't need to do this. We don't need to expand. The SEC is just fine with the playoff staying at 4. Then he can have this in his back pocket and say, this is my leverage. We're content to go do this if you're not able to compromise on those silly little things that you're getting hung up on.
Connor, you wrote a column about Saban v. Fisher 2022, and that what are your thoughts on that? You know, you said the micro issue is the argument, but the macro issue is much bigger than that.
Yeah, the macro issue is they want the same thing. That's the craziest thing. Have you ever seen two people like this have such different ways of communicating that they want the same thing? I mean, it's wild to think about what was said from Nick Saban and what was said from Jimbo Fisher in a essentially a 14-hour stretch here that we're talking about. And Nick Saban's, his entire point in that 7-minute answer, which if you watch what he said and not just the quote about A&M and buying their players in this recruiting class, was that he wants some sort of regulation for NIL. We want defined parameters for NIL. We want to be able to say, hey, federal government, tell us what NIL actually is. NCAA, actually enforce what NIL is. And instead, he used A&M very loosely as an example to show why NIL is all over the place right now, and it isn't necessarily making money off name, image, and likeness. And in the eyes of Nick Saban, it's essentially a player contract, and it is pay for play. And so that's what this disagreement is about. And Jimbo Fisher, I don't necessarily know that 100% of what he said was true, but at the same time, I totally get why he defended his program, why he was so frustrated that Nick Saban used that word bought when he doesn't have definitive proof that he bought all of his players in his recruiting class and that he was sitting there like somebody in an auction just bidding on art. It's a little bit different if we're talking about that now, though, in this NIL era where we're not entirely sure what's legal and what's not, especially if there's not going to be an enforcement agency like the NCAA.
Connor, do you feel like that was also a call to arms for his fan base to up their game a little bit, even though Alabama fans already have a pretty good game as is?
Yeah, no doubt. It absolutely was. It kind of gets lost in the shuffle that Nick Saban said, look, we need local business owners to help out our athletes. We want to make sure that they're taken care of. You know, they have a collective. He talked about that, and the players in the collective making equal pay, $3 million, 25 players total. And that's something that, of course, if you're a head coach and you're not preaching about that, you're not doing your job effectively, in my opinion. And Nick Saban absolutely is. And one of the things that's been kind of like misconstrued in this whole deal, some people are saying that Nick Saban's anti-NIL. That's not the case at all. If Nick Saban was anti-NIL, he wouldn't be bragging about Bryce Young making 7 figures before his first start at Alabama. He wouldn't be throwing out figures like that and talking about how Alabama has a collective. So I think there was absolutely a call to action with local business owners in town. I mean, he's talking in Birmingham. He wants to get those people on his side. Not that Nick Saban should have to really do that, given his resume, but it definitely felt like there was some motives with getting more people on board for NIL.
I do think the one thing that's cracked me up overall is the tactic of, well, I don't know if we can keep up. that he used a little bit with them, which is kind of funny coming from a guy who, honestly, if he asked them, I need like a hoverboard like the Silver Surfer, they'd be like, where do we get one? You need 10? Yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of it. I think what he's referencing is from a roster management standpoint about having somebody who maybe is guaranteed $200,000 their first 2 years on campus, but they only play 15 snaps. Then that creates a really frustrating thing to have to turn around and say, hey, I know you've been given this money, but this has been a really bad investment. And they've kind of looked back and been like, wow, what exactly are we doing here? And if that's just for the players who aren't even playing and that's what they're guaranteed, what's it going to be like when, we have these situations, or what's been perceived of a situation like Jordan Addison, where, you had somebody who entered the transfer portal who wasn't happy necessarily with the money that he was able to make at Pitt, a program that didn't have a collective. Like, what are those situations going to look like? If that's kind of the starting level for some of these guaranteed deals, it can get out of hand in a hurry. So I'll defend him, what he has to say from that standpoint. But you're right. I mean, it's still Alabama. It's still a place that's got, an athletic budget that's well into the 9 figures, and they can afford to make some things happen.
Connor, we a year ago, late July, it was the Texas-Oklahoma SEC story that Brent Zerneman broke from the Houston Chronicle, and of course it has really been feeding college football. It did for a long, long time. Here, as far as I say here, within the Big 12, the conference has kind of moved on with their expansion. Yes, Texas and Oklahoma are here for at least another year, 2 or 3. What is the thought in the SEC? How much is that even brought up on maybe a daily or during meetings basis?
Sure. So I think with the announcement that the ACC was going to be abolishing, with the expected announcement that the ACC was going to abolish divisions, which was first reported by Brett McMurphy, I think all of a sudden we kind of turned the page and said, oh, well, when's the SEC going to do this? Or would the SEC make this happen? We found out, of course, that the Big 12 was also having this, $17 to $20 million potential buyouts for the likes of UCF, Houston, and Cincinnati to be able to join the conference early. But that situation, and the more you kind of realize this, it's really different with Texas and Oklahoma. And there's not this same sense of urgency because the deal's done. Like, it's happening. They're at least coming to the SEC in 2025. We know that. It's all signed, sealed, delivered. But could they get bought out of that contract? I don't necessarily think there's going to be that sense of urgency from Greg Sankey's standpoint, because it's like you would have to be talking about $100 million at least per school to have to try and pay the Big 12 for that. And then you're talking about adding two more teams and having a 16-team super conference when we still only have a 14 playoff. So I don't think there's that sense of urgency from Greg Sankey's standpoint. And I think that they're going to maybe hold off and not necessarily push that, before it needs to be done. And they'll let the Big 12 kind of deal with their weird, awkward 2-year scheduling format.
Well, yeah, because there was a thought initially, well, the SEC will throw a life raft with Oklahoma. Texas probably has the money to pay for both of them, but they won't. And then again, why? There's no rush. The SEC's fine without them for right now. They eventually going to get them.
Yeah, I mean, the deal's done. It's not like they're still negotiating. If they were still at the negotiating table, this would be a different story. They're not. They're coming on board. Like, Greg Sankey did his job. He's like, all right, you know what? We pulled this off. We made this happen. We don't have to get any more people on board. Yeah, I mean, it'd be great in a perfect world if they didn't have to pay that massive buyout. But at the same time, I think they're kind of looking at the situation going, hey, we also don't want to cannibalize. We don't want to jeopardize our chances of having one team at least in the college football playoff, or even 2 teams. So why do we necessarily need this 16-team conference when we're still going to be stuck at a 4-team playoff? I think Greg Sankey is kind of looking at these moving pieces and understanding that the urgency might not necessarily be there.
Connor, what do you think of the the plans to eliminate the conference championship games in terms of the way that they were set up and allowing conferences to do it on their own? We've already seen the ACC, the Pac-12's already starting to react. The Big 12's been, just having the 2 best teams because they haven't had divisions, and now they're kind of on pause with the idea of moving forward with divisions because of that. How do you think the SEC approaches that? Does it stay status quo, or do they think about maybe different options?
I think they'll definitely have to think of different options when Texas and Oklahoma come on board. They might stand pat until that time comes. I don't think they're just going to get rid of divisions for the sake of getting rid of divisions. I think once they change the scheduling format, when Texas and Oklahoma are on board, then that's when they're going to have that conversation. Then either have the pods, the 14 pods, or they're going to have a system. What I advocated for was not having any divisions at all, just scrapping divisions and then having the one rivalry and then 7 rotating home and homes. That way you're having all of these kids at least get to go to an SEC campus once during a 4-year stretch instead of what it currently is. I mean, think about this, guys. Texas A&M joined the SEC in 2012. Georgia's first trip to College Station will be in 2024. I mean, that's what's the point of that? Yeah. You're not even in the same conference if you're doing that. The SEC is not going to get further removed from that by adding Texas and Oklahoma. That's not going to happen. They're going to come up with a new system. In my opinion, that would be the best. I realize that'd be scrapping, potential rivalries like Alabama and LSU, but still getting to play teams more regularly in your conference. The SEC is going to trend in that direction. It's just a matter of what exactly it's going to look like.
Texas has kind of always, and people say this, run the Big 12. They've had clout. We know they've had the hammer, Oklahoma as well. When they walk into the same room with everybody in the SEC, how many of those teams, programs, universities, campuses will look them straight in the eye and say, not here?
All of them. Look, I mean, even Mizzou, even Eli Drinkwitz kind of has that attitude, that chip on his shoulder, and he's not shy about going into the state of Texas and trying to recruit there. Look, no team in the SEC is going to back down to Texas. That's just not going to happen. Like, congratulations, you're able to fill your stadium. South Carolina fills 80,000 fans when they're coming off of a 2-win season, and it's 95 degrees in Columbia, and it's the hottest place on earth. So you're not going to impress anybody in the SEC by showing that money and being able to say, oh, we've done this, this, and this. Nah, in the SEC, it's all about getting those victories. That's all this conference cares about. If you're not consistently producing a quality program, which, let's be honest about Texas, it hasn't. When you haven't had a player drafted on the offensive side of the ball in the first round since 2006, you have a tough time getting respect from your elders. But that's what ultimately this situation is going to be. It's going to be probably a really similar reception to the one Texas A&M got. Yeah, cool, great, you fill up your stadium. Show that you can kind of, prove yourself on that stage. And Texas A&M did that year one with Johnny Manziel, of course. But I think Texas will have a little bit of a tougher time being able to kind of push its weight around.
Connor, I know this is kind of out of nowhere. Obviously, when SEC Media Days, the spring meetings, all that get underway here pretty soon, there's going to be a lot of focus on Jimbo and Saban, of course. But outside of that, there's new coaches like Billy Napier. There's new faces like Spencer Rattler. There's a lot going on. But what are maybe one or two of the top storylines you'll be focused in on?
What accent is Brian Kelly going to go with?
There you go. There you go.
Personally, I hope that he goes with maybe a little bit more of a Midwest type of twang to him. He says, "I'm sorry," after hitting the podium with his hand too loudly or something like that. There are a lot of different options, but seeing Brian Kelly kind of surrounded by his SEC peers is going to be fascinating. I think his acclimation into the conference, jokes aside, is one that's absolutely worth watching, and it's going to be fascinating to see that unfold. Yeah, the Spencer Rattler element is going to be interesting because he's the guy there. I mean, I've talked to Shane Beamer about him and his attitude that he's had since he arrived in Columbia, a very surprise destination for a lot of people. But when you kind of look at all the pieces working in his favor, all the offensive weapons he's going to have, the system he's going to play in, I think it makes kind of a lot of sense that he was able to put his trust in Shane Beamer. So I'm really interested to see that. And then obviously, how does Georgia respond from ending the 1980 jokes? What's Kirby Smart going to be like? Is he kind of showing up with a different kind of brash, a different kind of cockiness? Because it felt like he did last year going into the 2021 season. And that was the first moment I realized, wow, he really likes his team if he's coming off this confident at SEC Media Days. So, yeah, there will be no shortage of stories. And, Lane Kiffin will probably give us a worthy soundbite or two.
Connor, thanks for your time. There's also some stats that show up on his timeline. Again, it's at CJ O'Gara, CJOGARA, Connor O'Gara. Texas non-conference losses in the month of September since 2013, 12. Alabama's total losses since 2013, 12. Something's got to give is exactly what you said. They play each other coming up in Austin in September. Thanks for your time, Connor. Great to have you on.
Absolutely. Anytime, guys.
Thank you very much. He also has a stat on Notre Dame, and I know on occasion we have some that Notre Dame, since 1999, and I didn't realize this, Notre Dame's 2-21 against AP top 5 teams. Of course, most people's record against top 5 teams are not good anyway. The 2 wins against Michigan in 2005, and then 2 years ago when they beat Clemson, I think in the college football playoff.
No, they beat Clemson in the ACC.
ACC championship.
No,
what?
Clemson beat them then.
Regular season?
Regular season, yeah.
Okay. So those are but 2-21, there are, again, at top 5, you're not supposed to win many of those, and there's only a handful of schools, like 3 to 5, that probably have a winning record against top 5 teams, if that many.